The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' front porch as he settled into his favorite wooden rocking chair. At 93 years old, the World War II veteran had developed a routine that he followed with military precision. Every morning, he would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., a habit he had maintained since his days in the service more than 7 decades ago. Harold lived alone in his modest white house on Cedar Street, a home he had purchased in 1975 after retiring from his job as a high school history teacher. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, but he chose to stay in the house they had shared for so many years. Their memories were etched into every corner of the home, from the height markers of their grandchildren penciled on the kitchen doorframe to Margaret's collection of blue willow plates that still hung on the dining room walls. The neighborhood had changed significantly over the years, but Harold's property remained a testament to his dedication. His front yard featured the tidiest lawn on the block, with carefully trimmed hedges and flower beds that bloomed in perfectly arranged patterns. But it was his backyard victory garden that truly showcased his passion. He grew everything from tomatoes and carrots to green beans and potatoes, just as he had learned to do during the war years. Every morning after his breakfast of plain oatmeal and black coffee, Harold would put on his beige cap, the one with World War II veteran, embroidered in gold letters, and walk the 4 blocks to Joe's Diner. The walk took him exactly 17 minutes, using his wooden cane for support. The young waitress, Sarah, always had his usual order ready: 1 scrambled egg, 2 strips of bacon, and endless refills of coffee in his personal mug that hung on a special hook behind the counter. The other regular customers at Joe's treated Harold with respect, often stopping by his table to chat about the weather or ask for stories about the war. He didn't talk much about the difficult memories, but he enjoyed sharing lighter moments, like teaching French children how to play baseball in 1944, or the time his unit adopted a stray dog they named General Patton. Harold's peaceful routine also included afternoon gardening sessions, where he would tend to his vegetables while listening to big band music on his old portable radio. The neighbors' children would sometimes stop by, fascinated by the old man who seemed to make things grow like magic. He would often send them home with fresh tomatoes or carrots, along with simple lessons about patience and caring for living things. Life was simple but satisfying for Harold, until that fateful Tuesday morning in early summer. As he was preparing for his daily walk to the diner, he heard the first rumble of motorcycles. At first, it was just a distant sound, but it grew louder and more persistent. Looking out his kitchen window, Harold noticed a group of bikers gathering in the vacant lot next door. The lot had been empty since the old Thompson house burned down 2 years ago. The city had cleared the debris but never developed the land, leaving it as an open space that occasionally attracted teenagers or dog walkers. But this was different. These bikers seemed to be setting up some sort of meeting point, with their loud machines creating more noise than the neighborhood had heard in years. Harold watched as more motorcycles arrived, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. He counted 12 bikes, then 15, then 20. The riders were mostly young men, dressed in leather jackets despite the warm weather. They carried coolers and set up folding chairs, making it clear they planned to stay a while. As Harold stepped onto his porch, several of the bikers glanced his way. One of them revved his engine, creating a deafening roar that made Harold's windows rattle. Another biker laughed, and Harold could see them pointing in his direction. For the first time in many years, he felt uneasy in his own neighborhood. Little did Harold know that this morning marked the beginning of a challenging chapter in his life, one that would test his patience, courage, and wisdom in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. The peaceful mornings that Harold once enjoyed became a distant memory within just 2 weeks. The motorcycle club had turned the empty lot into their unofficial headquarters, and their presence grew more disruptive with each passing day. What started as a group of 20 bikes soon doubled, with new faces appearing regularly among the leather-clad crowd. Harold tried to maintain his daily routine, but even simple tasks became challenging. His morning walks to Joe's Diner now required him to pass through a gauntlet of parked motorcycles and lounging bikers. Some days, they would rev their engines just as he walked by, the sudden noise making him jump and clutch his cane tighter. Sarah, the kind waitress at the diner, noticed how Harold's hands would shake slightly as he sipped his coffee. "Are those bikers giving you trouble, Mr. Matthews?" she asked one morning while refilling his coffee cup for the 3rd time. Harold gave her a gentle smile but shook his head. "Nothing I can't handle, dear," he replied, though his eyes told a different story. He was a proud man who had faced German artillery in France. He didn't want to admit that a group of young troublemakers was affecting him so deeply. The situation at home wasn't any better. The bikers seemed to have no sense of time, gathering as early as 7 a.m. and sometimes staying until well past midnight. The constant rumble of engines made it impossible for Harold to enjoy his afternoon gardening sessions. His beloved big band music was completely drowned out by the roar of motorcycles and the heavy rock music blasting from portable speakers. One afternoon, while Harold was tending to his tomato plants, 3 of the younger bikers walked right up to his garden fence. They were drinking beer, and their voices carried a mocking tone that Harold recognized from his years as a teacher, the sound of trouble brewing. "Hey, old-timer," one of them called out, crushing his empty can and tossing it into Harold's yard. "Nice little garden you got here. Must be boring as hell playing in the dirt all day." Harold straightened up slowly, leaning on his garden spade for support. "Young man," he said calmly, "I'd appreciate it if you'd pick up that can and dispose of it properly." The bikers laughed, and another one deliberately dropped his can too. "What are you gonna do about it, Grandpa?" he sneered. "Call the cops. We're just enjoying the public space next door." Harold's neighbors began to notice the escalating situation. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street would watch anxiously from behind her curtains. Mr. Chen, who lived 2 houses down, offered to call the police several times, but Harold always declined. He remembered dealing with troublemakers during his teaching days and believed that escalating the situation would only make things worse. The weekends became particularly difficult. The bikers would host what they called rallies, which brought dozens of additional motorcycles to the neighborhood. They would park their bikes partially on Harold's property, leaving tire marks across his carefully maintained lawn. The air would fill with cigarette smoke and the smell of beer, while music blasted at all hours. Harold started finding empty bottles and food wrappers in his garden every morning. His prized roses, which he had planted with Margaret 20 years ago, were trampled multiple times. Each morning, he would quietly clean up the mess, his jaw set in determination, refusing to show how much the vandalism hurt him. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch trying to read his newspaper by the fading light, a group of bikers decided to have a motorcycle engine competition. Each one would rev their engine louder than the last, creating a deafening symphony of noise that rattled windows throughout the neighborhood. When Harold politely asked them to stop, they only laughed and revved their engines even louder. That night, as Harold lay in bed listening to the continued noise from outside, he thought about his options. He could sell the house and move to a retirement community, as his daughter had been suggesting. He could call the police and file complaints. Or he could try one more approach, something that had been forming in his mind over the past few days. Looking at the old photograph of himself in his military uniform that hung on his bedroom wall, Harold remembered something his commanding officer had told him during the war. Sometimes the best way to fight is not to fight at all, but to find unexpected allies. With that thought in mind, he finally drifted off to sleep, already forming a plan for the next day. The morning sun had barely risen when Harold heard the sound of breaking glass outside his house. He rushed to his window as quickly as his aged legs would allow, just in time to see 3 young bikers throwing empty bottles at his front porch. His "Support Our Troops" sign lay broken on the ground, its wooden post snapped in half. "Look what we have here, boys," shouted one of the bikers, pointing up at Harold's window. "The old man's awake. Want to come down and clean up your yard, Gramps?" Harold's hands trembled as he reached for his phone to call his neighbor, Mr. Chen. But before he could dial, he saw Mr. Chen already outside, taking pictures of the bikers with his cell phone. The young troublemakers noticed this and quickly jumped on their motorcycles, speeding away with loud roars of their engines. "I got pictures, Mr. Matthews," Mr. Chen called out, walking toward Harold's house. "We should show these to the police." But Harold knew that by the time any officers arrived, the bikers would be long gone. Besides, they'd always wore their helmets during these pranks, making identification difficult. Still, he thanked Mr. Chen for trying to help, and together they cleaned up the broken glass from his porch. The harassment didn't stop there. Later that week, Harold discovered motorcycle tracks running through his front lawn, cutting deep grooves into the grass he had carefully maintained for decades. The tire marks formed crude shapes that looked like they had been done on purpose, destroying large patches of his lawn. Mrs. Rodriguez brought him a fresh-baked apple pie that afternoon, trying to lift his spirits. "Harold," she said gently, watching him rake the damaged grass, "my son is a police officer. One phone call, that's all it would take." Harold shook his head. "Thank you, Maria, but that might make things worse. These young people, they're angry about something. I've seen anger like this before during the war. Sometimes fighting back just feeds it." But his peaceful approach was tested severely the next day. While walking to Joe's diner, 3 bikers followed him slowly on their motorcycles, revving their engines and circling around him like sharks. Harold's heart raced, but he kept walking, gripping his cane tightly. "Hey, old-timer," one called out. "Those war stories you tell at the diner? Bet they're all made up. Bet you never even served." Harold stopped walking. In all his years, no one had ever questioned his service. He turned slowly to face the bikers, his back straight despite his age. The morning light caught the World War II veteran pin on his cap, making it shine. "Young man," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of his years, "you're entitled to your opinion. But this pin, and the medals in my house, they tell the truth." The bikers laughed, but Harold noticed one of them, the youngest, looking uncomfortable. Still, they continued their harassment, following him all the way to the diner. When Harold finally reached the door, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn the handle. Inside, Sarah the waitress saw what was happening through the window and immediately called the police. But by the time they arrived, the bikers were gone. The police officer took notes, but without clear identification, there wasn't much they could do. That evening, Harold faced his worst discovery yet. Walking into his backyard to tend his victory garden, he found it completely destroyed. Motorcycle tracks crisscrossed through his carefully tended vegetable beds. The tomato plants he had nurtured from seeds were crushed. The bean poles were knocked over, and the carrots had been deliberately pulled up and scattered across the yard. Standing amid the ruins of his garden, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since the war. A deep, burning sense of helplessness mixed with determination. This garden wasn't just plants and vegetables. It was his connection to his wartime experiences when Victory Gardens helped feed a nation at war. It was where he taught his grandchildren about patience and growth. It was where he felt closest to Margaret's memory, as she had worked alongside him in this very soil for so many years. As the sun set behind the trees, Harold made a decision. He walked inside, picked up his phone, and dialed a number he had been hesitant to call. It was time to try something different. Something that would either solve the problem or make it much worse. Either way, he knew he couldn't let things continue as they were. The morning after his garden's destruction, Harold woke up before sunrise. He sat on the edge of his bed, looking at the old black and white photograph of himself and his army buddies from 1944. They were all smiling, young faces full of hope despite the war raging around them. Next to this photo was a more recent one of him and Margaret in their garden, taken just a year before she passed away. Harold put on his old work clothes and walked slowly to his backyard. The early morning light revealed the full extent of the damage. His victory garden, which had been his pride and joy for over 40 years, lay in complete ruin. Tire tracks cut deep paths through the soil, creating ugly scars across the once beautiful space. As he stood there, memories flooded his mind. He remembered teaching his grandchildren how to plant seeds in this very garden. "Gentle hands," he would say, showing them how to carefully place each seed in the soil. Everything worth growing needs patience and care. Now those lessons lay trampled in the mud. Sarah from the diner stopped by later that morning, bringing him his usual breakfast in a paper bag since he hadn't shown up at his regular time. "Mr. Matthews," she gasped when she saw the garden. "This is terrible. Who would do such a thing?" Harold accepted the bag with trembling hands. "The same young fellows who've been causing trouble," he said quietly. "But what bothers me most isn't the destruction. It's that they don't understand what this garden means." He told Sarah how Victory Gardens had helped feed America during World War II, how every family had grown their own vegetables to support the war effort. His garden wasn't just about growing food. It was about remembering a time when the whole country worked together for something bigger than themselves. Throughout the morning, neighbors stopped by to offer help. Mr. Chen brought garden tools. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with her teenage sons, ready to help her plant. But Harold thanked them all and asked for some time alone. He needed to think. Around noon, he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. The bikers were gathering again in the vacant lot, laughing and playing loud music. One of them shouted over the fence, "Hey, old man, how's your gardening going?" Harold stood up slowly from his porch chair. For the first time since the harassment began, he felt something change inside him. It wasn't anger. He had seen too much in his 93 years to let anger take control. Instead, it was a quiet determination, the same feeling he had experienced on D-Day as his landing craft approached Omaha Beach. He walked into his house and went straight to his study. Opening the bottom drawer of his desk, he pulled out an old address book. Its pages were yellowed, and many names had been crossed out as old friends passed away over the years. But one number, added recently by his grandson, was clearly visible. Before making the call, Harold looked one more time at his ruined garden through the window. He saw more than just destroyed plants. He saw Margaret's favorite tomato plants, crushed into the mud. He saw the carrots his great-granddaughter had helped plant last spring, now scattered across the yard. He saw the small American flag that had stood in the center of the garden, now broken and dirty. With steady hands, Harold picked up his phone. He wasn't calling the police. He wasn't calling his family. Instead, he was calling someone who might understand both sides of this situation, someone who knew about respect, about service, and about the power of standing together. As he dialed the number, Harold remembered something his commanding officer had said during the war. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Veteran Riders Association, the voice said. How can we help you? Harold took a deep breath and spoke clearly into the phone. My name is Harold Matthews. I served in World War II, 29th Infantry Division, and I need your help. The next few minutes of that phone call would set in motion events that would change not just Harold's life, but the lives of everyone involved in this conflict. Sometimes, he would later reflect, the darkest moments lead to the brightest solutions. Harold spent the rest of the afternoon waiting anxiously after his call to the Veteran Riders Association. At exactly 5:00 p.m., he heard the rumble of a single motorcycle coming down his street. Unlike the harsh, angry sounds he had grown used to, this engine purred with a deep, respectful tone. The motorcycle that pulled up in front of his house was different from the ones in the vacant lot. It was clean, well-maintained, and decorated with military branch insignias. Its rider, a tall man in his 70s, wore a neat leather vest covered in military patches. The man parked his bike, removed his helmet, and walked with purpose toward Harold's porch. "Mr. Matthews?" The man called out, standing at attention at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Jack Thompson, president of the Veteran Riders Association. Vietnam War, Marine Corps, 1968 to 1971. Harold stood up from his rocking chair and returned the military courtesy. Harold Matthews, World War II, Army, 29th Infantry Division, 1943 to 1945. The two men shook hands firmly, and Harold invited Jack inside. In his living room, Harold showed Jack his service photos, medals, and the now-destroyed Victory Garden through the window. Jack listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions about the motorcycle club's behavior. "Those boys don't understand what they're doing," Jack said, shaking his head as he looked at the ruined garden. "But we're going to help them learn. May I use your phone, sir?" Over the next hour, Jack made several calls. Harold listened as Jack spoke to various chapter leaders of the Veteran Riders Association. The conversations were short and direct, filled with military precision and purpose. "Don't worry, Mr. Matthews," Jack said after finishing his calls. "We're organizing something special for this weekend. Those young fellows next door need a lesson in respect, and we're just the teachers for the job." Throughout the week, Harold noticed something strange. Different motorcycles started appearing in his neighborhood. These riders were older, their bikes cleaner, and they would park briefly across the street, observe the troublemakers in the vacant lot, then ride away. They were scouts, Jack explained when he called to check on Harold, gathering information for what was to come. On Friday afternoon, Jack visited again, this time bringing Harold a special gift, a new Veteran Riders Association vest with honorary member patches sewn on it. "You'll need this for tomorrow," Jack said with a smile. "We're having quite a gathering." That evening, Harold could barely sleep. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope instead of dread when thinking about the next day. He remembered how it felt during the war when reinforcements would arrive just when things seemed darkest. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. The troublemaker bikers began gathering in the vacant lot early, as usual. By 10 a.m., there were about 30 of them, playing their loud music and revving their engines. Then they heard it, a deep, thundering sound approaching from all directions. Harold stepped onto his porch wearing his new vest and watched as over 100 motorcycles roared into the neighborhood. These weren't just any bikers. They were veterans from every American conflict since World War II, their bikes gleaming with military pride. The veteran riders formed a perfect circle around the vacant lot, their engines quiet but their presence overwhelming. Jack led a group of senior riders toward the younger bikers, who had fallen silent in surprise and confusion. Among the veteran riders were men and women who had served in Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Their vests displayed combat medals, unit insignias, and battle ribbons. Some walked with limps from old war wounds, but all moved with military discipline and purpose. Harold watched from his porch as Jack approached the leader of the troublemaker bikers. This wasn't going to be a confrontation, Harold realized. This was going to be something much more important, a lesson in honor, respect, and the true meaning of brotherhood. As the morning sun rose higher, Harold felt a familiar feeling in his chest, the same pride he had felt standing with his unit in France all those years ago. Sometimes, he thought, the best allies come from the most unexpected places. The vacant lot had never been so quiet. Where usually there were roaring engines and loud music, now there was only the sound of the morning breeze. Over 100 veteran riders stood in perfect formation around the lot, their bikes parked with military precision, creating a wall of chrome and steel around the younger bikers. Jack Thompson stood in the center of it all, his Vietnam veteran vest catching the morning sun. Beside him was Harold, standing straight despite his age, wearing his new veteran rider's vest over his usual plaid shirt. The leader of the troublemaker bikers, a young man with spiked black hair named Mike, stepped forward to meet them. "What's all this about?" Mike asked, trying to sound tough, but his voice wavering slightly. His usual confidence seemed to shrink in the presence of so many veterans. Jack's voice carried across the lot, clear and commanding. "This is about respect, son, and about learning who you've been harassing." He turned to Harold. "Mr. Matthews, would you like to tell these young men your story?" Harold stepped forward, and for the first time, the younger bikers really looked at him, not as an old man to torment, but as someone with a story to tell. His voice was steady as he began to speak. 79 years ago, Harold started. I was just about your age, June 6, 1944. D-Day. He paused as several veteran riders removed their hats. I was on the second wave at Omaha Beach. The water was red with blood, but we had to keep moving forward. The younger bikers stood silent, their usual swagger gone. Harold continued, describing how he and his unit fought their way across France, liberating towns from Nazi control. He told them about the friends he lost, about the civilians who thanked them with tears in their eyes, about the victory gardens that helped feed America during those difficult years. "That garden you destroyed?" Harold's voice grew stronger. "It's not just about growing vegetables. It's about remembering a time when our whole country came together, when everyone, young and old, did their part for something bigger than themselves." As Harold spoke, more veterans stepped forward. A woman in her 60s shared her experience as a nurse in Vietnam. A Desert Storm veteran described saving his entire unit in a sandstorm. A young veteran in his 30s talked about building schools in Afghanistan while fighting Taliban forces. Mike and his friends listened, their faces showing a mix of shame and growing respect. When one of them tried to light a cigarette during the stories, another quickly elbowed him to stop. "The thing about being a real biker," Jack added, "is that it's not about making noise or causing trouble. It's about brotherhood, respect, and standing up for what's right. Every one of these riders behind me would give their life to protect the freedoms that Mr. Matthews and countless others fought for." Then Jack did something unexpected. He walked over to Mike's motorcycle and examined it carefully. "Nice bike," he said. "You know how to maintain it well. How would you like to learn how to use that skill for something good?" Mike looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The Veteran Riders Association does charity runs," Jack explained. "We help veterans in need, support military families, and yes, we even help rebuild gardens." He looked meaningfully at Harold's destroyed yard. The message was clear. This wasn't just about punishment or shame. It was about redemption and understanding. Harold watched as the younger bikers began to talk with the veterans, asking questions about their service, their bikes, and their experiences. The tension in the air slowly transformed into something else: respect, curiosity, and the beginnings of understanding. One young biker approached Harold directly, removing his leather jacket to reveal a t-shirt underneath. "Sir," he said quietly, "my grandfather served in Vietnam, but he never talks about it. Would you? Would you tell me more about your service?" As Harold began to share more stories, he noticed Mike talking seriously with Jack, occasionally glancing at the ruined garden with what looked like genuine regret. The morning sun rose higher in the sky, shining down on an unusual gathering that was quickly becoming something none of them had expected: a bridge between generations. Sometimes, Harold thought, the best way to fight is not to fight at all, but to help others understand what they're fighting against. The transformation that took place in Harold's neighborhood over the next few days surprised everyone who witnessed it. The story began spreading through the community like wildfire: how a group of troublemaking bikers had been changed by their encounter with real veterans, and how a 93-year-old World War II veteran had won their respect not through force, but through wisdom and stories. Monday morning started differently than any other in recent weeks. As Harold prepared for his daily walk to Joe's Diner, he heard motorcycles approaching. His heart skipped a beat out of habit, but this time it was different. Mike and 3 other young bikers pulled up to his house, their bikes running quietly instead of roaring. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," Mike called out, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there before. "We were wondering if you'd like an escort to the diner this morning." Harold smiled and nodded. As they walked slowly beside their bikes, matching his pace, Mike spoke up again. "Sir, we spent all Sunday thinking about what you and the other veterans told us. We'd like to make things right." When they reached Joe's Diner, Sarah, the waitress, nearly dropped her coffee pot in surprise. Instead of harassing Harold, the young bikers were holding the door open for him, listening intently as he pointed out old photographs on the diner's walls showing the town during World War II. "This diner," Harold explained, pointing to a yellowed photograph, "used to be a gathering point for collecting scrap metal for the war effort. Everyone did their part back then." Over breakfast, Mike shared something he hadn't told anyone before. "My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran," he said quietly. "He passed away last year. I never really talked to him about his service. I guess I was too busy trying to look tough with my friends." As they ate, more stories emerged. One of the other young bikers had a sister serving in the Air Force. Another had considered joining the Marines but had been afraid of not measuring up. Harold listened to each of them, sharing his own experiences and wisdom. Later that day, Jack Thompson returned with a group of veteran riders. To everyone's surprise, Mike and his friends were already at Harold's house, working in the ruined garden. They had brought tools, new soil, and vegetable seedlings. "We watched some videos about victory gardens," Mike explained to Jack, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Matthews told us what everything looked like before he paused, ashamed, before we destroyed it. We're trying to make it right." The veteran riders joined in, and soon Harold's backyard was filled with both young and old bikers working together. The older veterans shared stories as they worked, teaching the younger generation about service, sacrifice, and the importance of respecting those who came before them. Harold sat in a lawn chair, supervising the work and sharing gardening tips. He showed them how to properly space the tomato plants, just as he had done during the war years. He taught them about companion planting, explaining how certain vegetables grow better together, just like people do when they respect and support each other. As the day went on, more neighbors came out to help. Mrs. Rodriguez brought cold lemonade for everyone. Mr. Chen took photographs to document the garden's restoration. The sound of motorcycles was still present, but now it was just the occasional gentle purr of bikes arriving with more supplies or volunteers. "You know," Harold said to Jack as they watched the work progress, "during the war, we learned that some of our greatest enemies could become our strongest allies. All it takes is understanding and respect." Jack nodded, watching as Mike carefully planted a new American flag in the center of the garden. The young biker stepped back, surveying his work with pride. He was wearing a new patch on his jacket, one that the veteran riders had given him, reading, "In service of others." By sunset, the garden was nearly restored, but more than plants had grown that day. New friendships had taken root, and old prejudices had been weeded out. The young bikers had learned that true strength isn't about making noise or causing trouble. It's about standing up for what's right and respecting those who paved the way before you. As everyone prepared to leave, Harold stood up from his chair and looked at his renewed garden. "This," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, "this is what victory really looks like." 1 month after the confrontation, Harold's neighborhood had changed so much that visitors barely recognized it. The vacant lot, once a source of chaos and noise, had been transformed into something remarkable. With permission from the city, the Veteran Riders Association and Mike's group had worked together to create a memorial garden and community gathering space. On a bright Saturday morning, Harold stood proudly in front of a crowd that had gathered for the official opening of the new Veterans Unity Garden. His restored Victory Garden was now just one part of a larger community project that had brought everyone together. A few weeks ago, Harold began his speech, his voice strong and clear. This was just an empty lot where trouble grew. Now look at what we've created together. He gestured to the beautifully landscaped space, where flowering plants bordered neat paths and benches invited people to sit and reflect. Mike stood near the front of the crowd, his leather jacket now decorated with both his original club patches and new ones from the veteran riders. His group had become regular visitors to Harold's house, not to cause trouble, but to learn from his stories and help maintain both gardens. "Mr. Matthews taught us that gardens aren't just about growing plants," Mike addressed the crowd. "They're about growing understanding between people." His friends nodded in agreement, standing tall beside their carefully parked motorcycles, which now carried American flags alongside their regular decorations. The vacant lot had been divided into sections. One area featured a memorial wall where veterans' names could be added. Another section had become a teaching garden where Harold, along with other veterans, showed local children how to grow vegetables, just like during the Victory Garden movement of World War II. Sarah from Joe's Diner had set up a coffee and breakfast station for the event. She smiled as she watched Harold interact with everyone, noticing how his hands no longer shook when motorcycles approached. Instead, he would wave to the riders, knowing each one by name. Jack Thompson stepped forward to make an announcement. "Thanks to Mike and his friends," he said, "we're starting a new program. Young riders can earn special patches by helping veterans in our community. Already, 20 local bikers have signed up." The program had been Mike's idea. After learning about Harold's service and helping restore his garden, he had realized that many elderly veterans in the area might need similar help. His once troublemaking group had found a new purpose, serving those who had served their country. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her 2 teenage sons receive their first patches for helping clean and maintain veterans' yards. Mr. Chen's photography of the transformation had been featured in the local newspaper, inspiring other communities to start similar programs. Harold's original Victory Garden was flourishing again, but now it had become a teaching tool. Every Saturday morning, weather permitting, he would host what he called garden history lessons. Young bikers and neighborhood children would gather around as he explained how Victory Gardens helped win World War II and how the spirit of community service was just as important today. "The vegetables we grow here," he would tell them, "feed more than our bodies. They feed our sense of connection to each other and our past." The sound of motorcycles was still common in the neighborhood, but it had changed. Riders would slow down respectfully when passing Harold's house, and the loud revving had been replaced by friendly waves and greetings. The veteran riders and Mike's group had established a code of conduct that all local bikers now followed. As the opening ceremony concluded, Harold watched as children played in the new garden while veterans and young bikers chatted on the benches. Mike approached him with a special gift, a custom-made plaque for his Victory Garden that read, "In honor of Harold Matthews, teacher of respect, growth, and understanding." "You know, sir," Mike said as he helped Harold hang the plaque, "when we first met, we thought we were the tough ones. But you showed us what real strength looks like." Harold smiled, looking at the community gathered around them. His garden had grown into something far more valuable than vegetables. It had grown into a bridge between generations, a symbol of respect, and a reminder that it's never too late to learn and change. As the sun set on that remarkable day, Harold sat in his porch rocker, listening to the peaceful sounds of his transformed neighborhood. Sometimes, he thought, the best victories are the ones that bring people together instead of pushing them apart.